the fact that our childhood wounds show up in our leadership today. And if there's anything I've seen over 20 years is the way leaders react to whatever circumstances, their perspective that they choose has everything to do with what happened to them in childhood. And we've all sustained some type of wound, more serious as trauma. But I bring a lot of research that shows that those formative years will impact your leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Eternal Optimist Podcast, the show for optimists by optimists. This is the show for people who see the good in the world and want to make a positive difference in the lives of their families and communities. Each week, you'll hear inspiring stories that will get you thinking bigger and playing more offense in life. With your host and high-performance coach, Matt Drinkon.
I'd love to move forward a little bit. And before we get to what you're creating and the excitement in the book, and one more story before we get to that, I'd love to ask you about somewhere in your professional leadership development career, there was a time when you had a really challenging case. A leader who thought it was all their people, it wasn't them. There was something just a challenging person to work with. Can you share an example or a story about someone that was challenging to work with, and how you may have helped them come to realize and make progress on their journey?
Oh my gosh, there are many stories like that. I'm thinking, like, which one should I tell? And thinking through that. And, I don't like to give specific client details. So, what I like to
Mm-hmm.
do is sort of talk in a character composite. So, let's just say,
Excellent.
which is what's in my book. I have 9 different examples, character composites of people I've worked with and their old playlists and how they shifted. I would say, in particular, I don't know if you know the Enneagram, but I work with the Enneagram a lot. It's a model of the way I use it is leadership styles, and there are 9 core leadership styles. So my style is called the enthusiastic visionary, which is a very optimistic person in general. That's type 7. But according to the model, and I have found it to be true, the biggest trigger for me could be the type 1, which is the strict perfectionist, or called the principled reformer.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly when I go back to the boss example that I just gave in leadership development, he was one of these type 1s, right? So you can see how that would trigger me. But also then fast forward, working with type 1s, I'm someone who comes from that there's multiple ways to do something,
Mm-hmm.
whereas this type of individual there's one right way to do things, and I know the right way, right? So we have very diametrically opposed perspectives. And in the model of the Enneagram, there's something that they have to learn from me and something I have to learn from them. So I think some of my hardest cases it showed up in that model of the Enneagram were the perfectionists that I worked with. And, I'm thinking one in particular was the way his perfectionism showed up was wanting to reform others. There are different varieties of the type 1. We call them subtypes. Some are trying to perfect themselves and very hard on themselves. Others are more outwardly focused and trying to perfect other people. And so this particular leader got a lot of feedback about the criticality of the type 1, and how it would take the wind out of their sails. So I'm trying to work with that, but in their mind it was always everyone else, right? It's
Mm.
not them. And couldn't even see that underneath it all they have incredible anger, because it doesn't show out as outward anger. It leaks through in irritation and criticism and resentment. But you can tell, they're stuffing down their anger. And so the way I worked with him is to really get clear that irritation or frustration is a form of anger. So if you don't want to say that you have anger living inside you, let's call it irritation and frustration. And let's start identifying why that shows up in a repeated pattern almost daily in your life. How does it serve you and how does it harm you? And the
Mm.
more he spent time understanding that it is just a perspective that he's choosing, because it's the irritation that things are less than ideal. Well, guess what? We live in a world that's less than ideal. So are you going to go through the rest of your life just always noticing what's not ideal and then choosing, and you have to remember this is a choice, choosing to be frustrated and irritated about it? Because what it's doing is creating a divide between you and the people that you need to connect with in your leadership and really in your family too. So that's a lot of the work we did. Was, I think, in any mindset there's a price and a payoff, and we get a payoff. We're usually more conscious of the payoff. It's why we do it, but we're not always conscious of the price. And I think illuminating the price of adopting that mindset, recognizing it is a mindset and it is just where the focus of attention is going, but you can shift that and letting people know that they don't have to be on autopilot anymore. They can shift that and shift the pattern.
That's such an excellent answer. I'm so glad that you went to the perfectionist, since I'm one of those recovering perfectionists. Thank you. You triggered something in my mind here, Susan. A quick side story. When I met Julie, who is now my wife, the very first day that we met, we met at a networking event. We went across the street afterwards, and we had a glass of wine. And she had just taken the Enneagram, and they were studying it at the company she was working at, and she quickly told me what she was. She's a 7, and she quickly diagnosed what I am, a 3. I don't even remember what the 3 stands for because I took the Enneagram later. I was not a 3. I was also a 7, but she diagnosed me as a 3. And our very first date we ever had, the Enneagram was the subject matter. So thank you for bringing that up. That was good.
As it is mine too.
Yes. Um, so
Well,
let's move
that's
forward. Let's.
you realize, because you're a type 7, by the way, just as a sidebar, you're a type 7. And why is it that your podcast is called The Eternal Optimist? Because
I
that
know,
is your
right?
signature, right?
You're
The
sharing some of these
optimism.
things. Well, definitely the
Yeah.
optimism, and I'm going to borrow some of your wisdom when you shared the phrase illuminating the price of what they're paying by being stuck in that place where they look at the things that are less than ideal and focus on that rather than. I would say focus on the things they have achieved and what they could choose to focus on. So I love the way you brought that. I'm going to go back and listen to that. For those of you out there listening, this could be a great place to bookmark and backtrack for a minute or two, because Susan just gave us a master class on working with what I would call recovering perfectionists, which is a lot of what I do too. So I just so appreciate what you just shared. That was excellent. And I think it demonstrated, not that you needed to, but it demonstrated your expertise in the field. I love to shift to that expertise in the field that you just shared and talk about what are you creating now? What is out there right now that we could follow, we could learn from? Just share with us a little bit about where you are now and how we might connect with you and follow you, learn from you, Susan.
Yes, well, it's truly right now about the premise of my book, The Leaders Playlist, which is unleashing the power of music and neuroscience to transform your leadership and your life.
Mm.
And in the book, what I talk about are two main tenets, and I bring a lot of research to bear on it. The fact that our childhood wounds show up in our leadership today. And if there's anything I've seen over 20 years is the way leaders react to whatever circumstances, their perspective that they choose has everything to do with what happened to them in childhood. And we've all sustained some type of wound, some more serious as trauma, but I bring a lot of research that shows that those formative years will impact your leadership, and they will impact it in two ways. It will give you a superpower, and it's probably why you've been able to rise to a leadership position, but it also comes with it a liability or a blind spot. And if you don't work to either have someone in your team that can see that blind spot and you be open to their perspective, or work to widen the aperture, the periphery of what you see, it will put a ceiling on your leadership effectiveness and you'll have trouble continuing to scale. So there's this whole piece, but then there's this whole piece about music, right? And for the listeners, are probably like, music, what the, but just remember, I have a master's from the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. And
Mm.
what I discovered was how to use the power of music and its impact on the brain to create new habits and make change stick and make change faster. So I bring in a
Mm.
lot of research about the impact of music on the brain. If you know anything about how they use it, music therapy for Alzheimer's patients who are unresponsive, who can't even communicate, they put on music from their era and then they come alive and they can hold conversation for 20 minutes, sometimes after the music ends. Well, what's going on there with the brain? And I got very fascinated. I used it in my own life to make some important changes I needed to make. And I started using it with my clients. So I use the term playlist both figuratively and literally.